Well, good evening, and thank you for joining the TSCRA Traceability webinar tonight. As you all know, we have a new traceability, not new, but revised traceability ruling that's come down from the USDA going into effect this November 5th. And so as we look to provide content and education on that, we've got four industry experts with us tonight on behalf of TSCRA. And so I just want to say thank you to each of you for joining. So I'll quickly introduce them and then we will get into a question and answer period. For those of you that are watching live tonight, if you have a question throughout the webinar or at the end of the evening, there is a Q&A or a chat box at the bottom of your screen. So please put any questions that you may have throughout the webinar in those two boxes, and we will try our best to answer all of them at the end of our moderated questions. So with us tonight, we have Austin Brown III from Beeville of Brown Land and Cattle, a cow-calf operation down in South Texas. Ken Jordan, owner of Jordan Livestock Auction in San Saba and Mason. Sigrid Johannes at NCBA. She's a senior director who oversees traceability efforts in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the beef industry. And Dr. Alex Turner, a veterinarian with the USDA, who has been charged with implementing the new traceability efforts out of Fort Collins, Colorado. So thank you so much to each of you for joining. And without further ado, we will go ahead and begin our questions so that we can make the best use of our hour this evening. Let's start with where we have been in the world of traceability. And so, Dr. Turner, you've been a part of this for many years. Traceability has been around for over a decade. This isn't a new concept. Why don't you catch us up kind of on where we have been over the last 11 years?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Emily, and thanks to everybody for having us here for this gathering tonight. But as a reminder, traceability, as APHIS and USDA and Veterinary Services considers it, really went into regulation back in 2013 with a rule that was in the Code of Federal Regulations, and that's 9 CFR Part 86, Animal Disease Traceability. And what that traceability rule really did at that time was set forth requirements for interstate movements for covered classes of livestock. And those movements were kind of broken down into two things: what identification is required for those movements, what official identification is required, as well as what documentation is required for those movements. And then for cattle and bison specifically, there were further qualifications for which movements are covered, like what classes of animal and which movements to certain destinations are not covered or don't require official ID or don't require documentation in the same way. And so those regulations have been in place for 11 years, as you mentioned, and really have not changed in those 11 years. And so this is the first opportunity that we were charged with to do any kind of a change to that rule. And the main change that we focused on was what constitutes official ear tags for cattle and bison. And just as a reminder, it didn't change all of official ID for cattle and bison, because for movements that were using brands for interstate movements as their official ID, or tattoos, or group lot ID, which is certainly not the majority of how most cattle and bison movements qualify for interstate movements. But if those movements were using those forms of official ID, they can continue to do so after this rule goes into effect on November 5th this year, 2024.
Great. Sigrid, you're in DC. You've been in the thick of watching this come through the process really for the last several years as how we have gotten here. So catch us up kind of on the what is different from the 2013 rule that Dr. Turner just mentioned to now in 2024, what's going to go effect next month?
Yeah, certainly. So there are a lot of things that are not different, and Dr. Turner just touched on one of those, which is the use of other types of official animal ID. But I think that's a good place to start with what is not changing here. The biggest thing that is important to note is that nothing is changing from the 2013 rule in terms of which types of cattle this applies to. So the 2024 rule that we are headed towards here on November 5th still only applies to cattle that are sexually intact 18 months and older, as well as all dairy cattle and all animals going to rodeo, show, and exhibition. In addition, it doesn't apply to cattle that are staying within the state. So we are still only talking about interstate movement across state lines, just like we have been since 2013. So those are some of the things that are not changing. One big item there that I want to flag is feeder cattle. We've gotten a ton of questions over the last few weeks and months. Does this apply to feeder cattle? And the answer is no, just like the 2013 rule did not apply to those animals. The other thing that's not changing, Dr. Turner mentioned, is the other types of official animal ID. So if you're moving across state lines with one of those classes of covered cattle, using a group or lot ID number, a brand, those are still good to go. The one piece that's changing is that type of ear tag. If you move a covered class of cattle across state lines using an ear tag as your form of official animal identification, that tag come November 5th will have to be metal, or visually readable as well as electronically readable. So we're moving from the metal tags that are just visual to the 840 tags that are also electronically readable. One big caveat that I have to add in there, or Dr. Turner might reach through the screen and throttle me, is that tags in before November 5th are grandfathered in under this rule. It's important to keep in mind that you don't have to go back and re-tag any animals. If they've already got a metal clip in the ear prior to November 5th, you're good to go. But this is only talking about new tags going in ears from November 5th onwards. And one other thing that I just wanted to mention really quickly, Emily, because you touched on a little bit the process leading up to this. Speaking for NCBA here tonight, I think it's important to note that kind of the process that went into developing this rule, it stretches back to 2013, but really even more so from the industry's perspective, it goes back to 2016 and the beef industry long-range plan, and then the WPI report that came out of that as well. The reason I mention that is because we've gotten some questions from folks over the last few weeks of kind of, where did this come from? Did it come out of a vacuum? You know, did the industry get any more opportunity outside of that 1 year comment period last year to kind of shape this thing? And the answer is yes. This has been a conversation back and forth with APHIS for the last 5, 6, 7 years to make sure that this is something that is narrow in focus, that gets the job done in terms of animal disease traceability, but most importantly is something that's going to work for industry and something that protects producers' data privacy.
Thanks, Sigrid. Austin, you're on the ground. You are a cow-calf producer, much like probably many of those that are watching tonight are. But you're also a member of the TSCRA board, and you've been on our TSCRA working group for over a year now. So why don't you kind of catch us up on where TSCRA stands on this issue politically that's coming down November 5th? Austin, I think you're on mute.
Okay, I'll start over. Sorry about that. All right, so I appreciate the opportunity to be here this evening on this call. Appreciate the opportunity to help, hopefully, obviously talk about this rule and clarify a lot of the points and some of the misinformation out there about this. Cattle Raisers has been working on this issue. We've been at the forefront of every discussion that between USDA, APHIS, and a lot of folks. Cattle Raisers has been there with the input behind Cattle Raisers of many thousands of cow-calf producers across the state and in a couple of other states too. And we've always felt it's been very, very important for efforts like this to be producer driven, for the ideas to certainly come from producers, for producers to have a seat at the table. If we're not at the table, you've heard the cliche saying, we're on the menu. And so we have been very, very adamant about being a part of these discussions, and frankly, being part of the solution of trying to figure out this whole animal ID traceability issue that can be extremely touchy in certain circles and in certain aspects of the cattle business. TSCRA and myself personally, we are in favor of a voluntary animal disease traceability program, but a very, very robust program, one that we can actually trace animals in a very efficient amount of time, very quickly, with as little red tape as possible. And I think one of the ways that this is going to be accomplished is through the use of electronic ID now versus a metal clip. Like you've heard Sigrid and Dr. Turner say, the only change for the average rancher, such as myself, is moving away from a metal clip and into an electronic tag. I do not have to electronically identify my cow herd that is on my ranch. There's no need to do that. Now, I do it for personal operational reasons, for further animal identification, for the ease of animal traceability within my bookkeeping systems. But I'm not required by the government now, because of this rule, to go in and electronically tag all of my cows. But cattle raisers is, like I said, is very much in favor of a voluntary program. And we want to be part of the ones that are helping form these rules and make this thing work, because at the end of the day, we need animals to be traceable, not because John Doe wants to find out where a cow came from, but in the event of something, it probably doesn't get any more serious than FMD. In the event that breaks out and hypothetically it came from brown ranches, they're going to find it out. The difference is going to be being able to narrow that field down as quickly as possible and save a bunch of my neighbors. If we can get this thing, these animals traced and tracked, and get the scope of the search narrowed down as quickly as possible, it saves many, many other producers from a much wider blanket quarantine, so to speak, of whatever disease we may be working on. And so that's why this is so incredibly important, is for disease traceability. No one wants to know about our data, about our personal information, any of that. It is for disease traceability, and it will help the industry.
Dr. Turner, there's been a lot of questions on the management and data storage of this information. As we know, and there's a lot of traceability resources available on TSCRA's website. These records will be currently stored at USDA. And we've been getting a lot of questions from our producers and a lot of concerns, I think, in state on how that's actively being handled. So can you shed some light on that process? We obviously, TSCRA values our relationship with USDA and have had a great relationship with USDA. But can you explain kind of some USDA thinking and some background on what that data management process looks like?
Sure, and I guess I could clarify a little bit there, and again, kind of going back to the simplistic view of what the rule requests and requires. If you break it down to official ID, then that's one part of the information and data that is being generated with this, is information around those official ID devices. And then the second part of that, which I'll come back around to, are those movement documents that we mentioned too, and how those are captured. So the official ID devices, what the information that USDA keeps for that, for those, especially for those electronically readable devices, is really the distribution records of those devices, down to the level of either the state that might be taking possession of those tags and then distributing them further, or the producer who's purchased tags from a manufacturer. And so those manufacturers, when they get those orders, require either a federal premises ID number or PIN, or a state-generated location ID number, or a LID, are the two acronyms that we use for those two location identifiers. And so the information that's kept around a single 840 number, which is the number that we use here in the US to designate an animal that is born in the USA, on these official ID devices. And to get that official 840 device, the producer or the person ordering the tags needs to provide a PIN or a LID that, for the most part, has been distributed or generated for that premises by the state veterinarian's office. So the two pieces of information that USDA has is, if it is a federal PIN, USDA has that random set of numbers associated with that PIN and the geographic location and information associated with that for the PIN. Then for the device itself, for the 840 number, the only thing associated with that 840 number is that random set of characters that goes with that PIN number. If it's a state LID number, the state shares the random LID numbers with USDA's database for verification prior to distribution or sale of those tags. But the USDA doesn't keep that information when it's a state LID. And some state animal health officials, some state veterinarians' offices will actually do most of their stuff through their animal disease traceability program with a state-generated LID. And that can be either due to preference within the state industry, or sometimes even state regulations that require the state to do that. So, and again, that's really the contact information to go with a specific geographic location is all that's required for a PIN or a LID. Now, to go back to the movement documentation, in most cases, the documentation we're talking about is actually an interstate certificate of veterinary inspection, or a health certificate, most of us know it as. Those health certificates actually, for the most part, USDA does not keep those documents as far as traceability documents goes. USDA does have a single database that we use that can generate health certificates for accredited veterinarians, and that is by no means the most popular electronic system out there, but it does house some of those documents in the country for livestock health certificates. With that, that's up to 3 databases I've mentioned that USDA has and each one has its own very specific job to oversee that specific set of information. And all 3 of those databases are protected via Freedom of Information Act regulations by a couple of exceptions. And those 2 exceptions, they basically prevent the USDA from sharing with any requester who's requesting through Freedom of Information Act or FOIA. Somebody requesting information, that information can be redacted if it's found to be personally identifiable information, or if it's found to be business confidential information. And those exceptions have held up for multiple requests across the years for producers' information, such that for the small amount of national ICVIs we have, for example, the information that gets redacted out of that is the origin address, the destination address, the shipper's address, the number of animals, the county they're going to, the veterinarian's information, as well as if there's any official identification information on there. So if somebody were to request a copy of that interstate certificate of veterinary inspection from us, and we gave them that document is going to look a lot like a zebra stripe document with all of the black redaction boxes that you've seen across there, because all of that information is considered either personally identifiable information to the producer, to the veterinarian, to the destination, or it's considered business confidential information. And so in both of those cases, that gives us kind of a couple of sets of protections to redact that information if we do get one of those requests from somebody who might have other plans for the information. So that's the information that we have and how that information is protected. And each of those databases I mentioned is only accessible to federal or state regulatory officials who have to undergo security clearance and screening, and who then only have access to the state that they work in. So there's very few of us even within USDA APHIS who have the national rights to, or the national view of those databases, to be able to see data in multiple states. So if you were a Texas animal health official, you would have access to all of the Texas records, or the records associated with Texas. You would not have access to records that were generated or associated with Oklahoma, unless it was something that was directly also related to Texas. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense and kind of helps to clarify those things. But it's those three databases contain just about all of the traceability information we have, and are all protected by those same Freedom of Information Act exceptions if somebody were to try to request any part of those information pieces.
Emily, may I add on a little bit there?
Please.
So in addition to, obviously, we share TSCRA's concern about data privacy. That was an item that NCBA spent a lot of time on during the formulation of this rule. But I just want to add a few more things onto what Dr. Turner said. Again, cannot stress enough, these databases, whether it's at your state veterinarian's office or at APHIS, are not accessible to the general public. And so in addition to those two FOIA exemptions that Dr. Turner mentioned, which are in the law, they are in the Freedom of Information Act, built in sort of as a means of protection. There are sort of two other items that we're really pushing for to just be doubly sure that that information is sealed up tight and not available to the public. And so one of those is a piece of case law, a precedent that was set in the Eighth Circuit of Federal Court in 2015. It's a case between the EPA and the American Farm Bureau Federation. And this was a case where aggregated CAFO data, feedlot data, was requested through a FOIA request. And we got a very interesting and very significant ruling in that case in 2015 that said that releasing that aggregated farm or ranch data would be a violation of those producers' right to privacy, and therefore was not lawful under those FOIA exemptions. So that's one case that I think it's really important for people to know about, because NCBA has actually already used this once to stop the disclosure of farm and ranch data. Some of you might remember, who are listening, a rule that was proposed by the SEC recently to collect what they called Scope 3 emissions reporting, basically going as far down the supply chain as they could and requiring publicly traded companies to collect all kinds of greenhouse gas and carbon related information. This would have stretched all the way back to the ranch gate. It was a pretty extraordinary and burdensome proposed rule. But we brought that case, that 2015 case, to the SEC and made the argument that their proposed rule would violate that ruling, and it worked. And we got that rule withdrawn before it ever went final. So this is something that we know works. It's a tool that we're going to keep in our tool belt. But in addition to that, and those existing exemptions under FOIA, we're also looking for that third piece of the puzzle. We always like to have a regulatory solution, a judicial solution, and a legislative one. And so we are also working on a bill with Senator Barrasso from Wyoming and Congressman Johnson from South Dakota that would just put that final nail in the coffin and make it explicit in legislative text that no EID tag data can be disclosed in response to a FOIA request. Again, we're doing overkill here, but when it comes to people's information, I think overkill is appropriate. And so we're trying to get that third piece as well passed, hopefully this year, and if not, certainly early in the next Congress.
Thanks. That's great, Sigrid. We're going to switch gears a little bit. Ken, Jordan, I'm going to come to you. We're getting a lot of questions from the market side of things, and I think that's where a lot of questions lie. So as a sale barn owner yourself, arguably sale barns are going to see more movement of cattle than most, if not all entities in the beef industry. And so if you wouldn't mind, give us your perspective, your personal opinion on traceability, but then also what's expected of sale barns under this new rule. What's going to change on your end?
Emily, appreciate you asking me to be on this call tonight. When you look at overall the sale barn activity, you look back historically, we're doing a lot of ID to a degree back with the news tag. We call them metal clip tags, what most of us are used to describing it as. Throughout the brucellosis timeframe, we had to tag every animal, adult animal, 18 months or older, through the facilities and document those and everything. There's a lot of markets that are still document those. They're still putting in the metal clips and have been for years now. Put them on a certain farm, then send that to Animal Health Commission just to track the animals where they go to the packing house, where they have maybe a problem with TB or a problem with some kind of residue or or whatever. So that's still been in place as a whole, but not required. They just have done that for their management standpoint. With this new rule and the way we've interpreted it and understand it, there's really no requirement at all for the markets. If they are not doing anything today, they're really not required to do anything tomorrow or as of November the 5th. Where it does come a liability, not very liability requirements do, is that the veterinarian requires that the health certificate on 18-month-old animals. They then, if they have to run through the chute, make sure that they either have a news tag. If they do not have the metal clip, they'll have to apply an electronic ID. Now, if the market is willing to assist that vet, they could be involved in helping them apply that electronic ID in the animals that do not have a metal clip. One other thing, if a market is now an approved, which we are in all of our markets, is a approved tagging facility, we've been that way for a good while. And what that allows the producers, we do a lot of female sales. So we have cattle that do come out of other states, Oklahoma, sometimes Louisiana, and places that they're able to come into our facility. So we're approved tagging facility. If you are a market like that, it's a service we provide to those producers. We will then now still take the cattle through the chute. If they got a metal clip, all we'll do is record that on our paper form. If they do not have a clip in there, we'll put an EID in there and record that. Probably at this point in time, being we don't have a lot of EID requirements as far as cattle that need to have that, we can still do that manually too. Eventually, we may read that tag with a reader and so forth. But really and truly, unless you're not providing those kind of services, as a whole, very few markets will be involved and have to do anything different than what they're doing today. So at this point, basically, it's the same thing we're doing. If you're involved a little bit more and considered a tagging facility, we do not have to distribute tags or anything of that sort. If you want to, you can. It just requires a lot more things you got to do, but that's your decision as a market facility. So producers, I've had a lot of our producers out there like, what am I going to have to do starting November the 5th? Do I have to tag every animal? No, you don't have to tag anything if you do not want to. And when you come to the facility, we'll continue to do what we do. If some facilities do continue to tag, they can tag. We got the EID tags that are available. If they got metal clips, they'll continue with that. And so really the requirement comes if you move cattle across state lines, you got to go to interstate shipment. Then you'll have some of them can have metal clips and some of them will have EIDs. A lot of cattle come there. We're still seeing a lot of CAFID vaccination tags that are in these females that are we're going to see some of these metal clip tags in for the next 10 years that are okay to utilize still. But all the CAFID vaccinations now that are taking place, and you'll have basically a red electronic ID in those. And so if they cross state lines, you'll have to read those either manually or through a reader at that point in time, put them on the health script. That's really the veterinarian's requirement to do that.
And to add on to this, because there is a lot of questions, and I'm seeing a lot of questions come in through the Q&A box, which we will certainly get to at the end of this. Do you anticipate any market or economic changes to come from this at the barns from this ruling?
I do not see that at this point because there's really no requirement for the barn to actually tag any of those cattle. If any of the adult cattle of 18 months or older are going out of state, the veterinarian who issues that certificate at that point in time. So that's a veterinarian's responsibility. Now, will the market help assist them doing that? Some of them do that today. They have to put a metal clip if they don't have one in there. They assist them that way today. If they don't, they will have to put an electronic ear tag now in them. And that veterinarian is one that's going to be responsible for that. Now, there's like ourselves, we do and are qualified as a tagging facility so we can assist our producers. But we're not having the tags are coming to us free. So any animals, we do put electronic ear tag if they come out of state into our facility. And that's only adult females, 18 months. It's not feeder cattle. It's nothing of that sort at all. We will not be charging anything additional to those producers if we had to put electronic ear, because right now we are getting those tags through the Animal Health Commission from the USDA at no cost. So we're not passing any additional costs because there's not really additional cost to us at this time.
Thanks. Sigrid, to add on to that, there's been, I think, some rumors out there that this could eventually become a mandatory rule across the industry. And so I use that word carefully because it is mandatory for certain classes of cattle November 5th, but it's not mandatory industry-wide November 5th. have you heard any conversation in DC about that? I think that's a question that we get a lot. And then, we look at the continuing resolution that was just included in APHIS's spending authority to purchase more tags last week in Congress. Where does that play into this conversation?
Well, I think there's concern down the road. There's been a lot of discussion about, are we going to move from here into the feeder cattle? We've been with the news tags now for I don't know how many years. I know back through Texas, the brucellosis programs, and that's never expanded into feeder cattle. We've got a big issue if we try to expand that quickly or into any kind of feeder cattle thing, is because of speeder commerce. Speeder commerce is very important to this industry. And so I think we've taken close to 10, 12 years of even getting just moving from the metal clip to an EID tag, and it's basically a tag. They're not easy to read sometimes. I mean, you have to get real close to them. We've been through some of these EID tags for a number of years now, and there's something that you've got to get very close to. It's not something you can read from a very far distance at all. So as far as moving that direction, we've taken this long to even move in this. The speed of commerce through our industry at this point in time, and the other countries that have tried it have not done very well in overall mandate any kind of overall ID program. I think we as associations throughout the time, voluntary has been the mannerism in which we wanted to move in that aspect of it. And I think we'll continue that as an industry as a whole to work that away. This is not going to be an intrusive. I mean, what I see and what I've got to do and requirements to do as producers for them, not going to be an intrusive requirement at all in this point. We're just changing the type of tag we're putting in the animals. Now, a lot of people are concerned about those tags. I know they've concerned about that you could read them from satellites or whatever. We have trouble sometimes reading them within an inch or two of the cattle sometimes. So it's not an issue at that point in time. We have done a lot of experiments with back tags, with the different tagging capabilities there. Say low frequency, it's high frequency. We've had a lot of luck with those. And so those are some of the things we have done through some of our programs and have worked well through management programs, not through USDA and all those type of programs. So I think that I've had a lot of my producers come to me, where do I get my tags? Do I have to tag everything that comes to your facility? No. Tomorrow, November the 5th, there's nothing changes at all for what the producer has to do. Now, unless you're shipping your cattle to another state, but the vet will come in and tell you that when he does his health certificate. And at that point in time, he'll address those needs for you. But if it's coming to our local market, there will not be any change at all that you'll see or costs that'll add on to that.
Emily, can I add on a little bit there? So
Yes,
you asked some good questions about, and Ken just teed it up perfectly there. And I agree, there are some concerns if you move this into an industry-wide mandate about making sure that things still move efficiently at the speed of commerce. I think there's a couple items I want to touch on there, and I'm going to back up a little bit because I believe it was Mr. Brown mentioned earlier, TSCRA's voluntary stance, the policy to support a voluntary traceability program. NCBA's policy is a little bit different, and I want to explain that because we get a lot of questions on that. Obviously, we have state affiliates all across the country, TSCRA being one that is extremely valued, and we really lean on our relationship with our affiliates a lot when it comes to formulating our stances on these issues. We don't lobby in DC on anything that doesn't make it into our policy book. And I know a lot of you on the phone might be NCBA members and have seen that process in action. But at the end of the day, NCBA has had a policy on the books regarding animal disease traceability for several years now. We passed one in 2020 through the Cattle Health and Wellbeing Committee that voiced support for Cattle Trace, which is an initiative that many of you might be familiar with. And then we had an amendment to one of our main policies on this topic, actually just this past winter at CattleCon in Florida. But I think it's important to clarify NCBA's policy book does not specify voluntary or mandatory. That neither of those words appears in Cattle Health 10.4, which is the policy that describes our goals for a animal disease traceability system. So because of that, we don't lobby voluntary or mandatory. That's not something that's in the policy book, and therefore it's not something that we specify. What is in the policy book and what we have strived for is protections for data, making sure that the burden of buying these tags doesn't fall on cow-calf producers, making sure this is compatible with state brand inspections, making sure that it can operate at the speed of commerce, all of the things that you've heard about tonight. So that's where our focus has been. I think that sets up the stage for a feeder cattle rule. So in terms of voluntary or mandatory, again, that's not something that's in our policy book, but what I can tell you is that we do not anticipate a feeder cattle rule at this time. I think we are many years, and when I say many, I mean 8, 10, maybe longer years away from that being a reality. Just like Ken mentioned, NCBA has gotten a lot of questions as well. I get many calls a day from folks saying, is this something that's going to expand on me next year, and be a perpetually moving target where I'm going to have to tag all my feeder cattle next year? The answer to that is no. And I know we have Dr. Turner on the line. I'm sure he can add to this as well, but it took 11 years for this rule to be formulated. It would take at least 11 to do a feeder cattle rule. And so I think we are still a long ways away from that being a SDA. The other, the cusp of an election. And while obviously we would love for everything in DC to run perfectly and smoothly and sort of divorced from politics, that's just not the way it is. And so there's also something to keep in mind that when we get a new administration in, whichever one that may be in January, the appetite to sort of explore a feeder cattle rule might drop off pretty darn sharply there. You touched on the CR as well, Emily, and I just wanted to mention that as well pretty quickly. So a continuing resolution, a CR, is kind of the Band-Aid that Congress slaps on our national finances every year. It's one of the only jobs where you can not do your job for 99% of the year and then kick it to the last week of December. But they have failed to pass a regular appropriations package per usual. They didn't get that done prior to recessing for the election, but they did pass a continuing resolution, which is basically short-term funding through December 20th. One of NCBA's priorities in that continuing resolution was to make sure that APHIS would have the authority to buy tags when the new fiscal year starts today on October 1st. I can't speak to what that schedule might look like. That's something that I would defer to Dr. Turner on in terms of when those orders might happen. But we did clarify and make sure that they do have that authority under the continuing resolution. So in plain English, what does that mean? It means that operating under this stopgap funding shouldn't interfere with APHIS's ability to purchase tags. Again, can't guarantee when they're going to do that. That's something that Dr. Turner would have to answer, since I am not over at the agency there. But we are pleased that we got that clarity in this CR process, and I think it's just one less factor that we have to worry about now, at least until December 20th. December 20th, this is a live ball again, and we're going to be involved very closely with all of our allies in Congress, trying to make sure that they get a full year of funding, a full fiscal year 25 omnibus passed as expeditiously as possible, because there's a lot riding on that. And not only is there the authority to purchase tags, there's also the money to do so. In fiscal year 24, NCBA got language in the appropriations bill directing APHIS to spend $15 million on EID tags and related infrastructure to help implement this rule. That's one of the pieces in the puzzle here of making sure that this cost doesn't get passed on to producers. We've got the same language in the draft fiscal year 25 bill. So we need to get that bill passed at the end of the calendar year here to make sure that that supply of tags remains available to producers next year. And that's going to be a top priority for NCBA.
Great. Thanks, Sigrid. Austin, I'm going to come back to you. In your opinion, for private treaty transactions, and let's include fall bull sales in this conversation. We've got a lot of fall bull sales coming up on the calendar very soon. Where do you think the responsibility lies for tagging a lot of these private treaty animals that are going to be 18 months and older? You're muted.
Sorry, I forget that every time. The other thing we do, aside and apart from a cow-calf operation, is I have a preconditioning yard here at the ranch where we specialize in growing seed stock replacement, registered seed stock cattle for various breeders, Charolais, Beefmaster, you name it. We raise bulls and heifers and prepare these to become breeding age bulls and heifers for fall bull sales, spring bull sales, and so forth. So from a personal perspective and from our what I do here at Brown Land and Cattle, if I'm in the business of selling registered bulls or registered females, it's my responsibility to take advantage of every avenue that I can to make my cattle more marketable. And if that means putting in an electronic tag in that bull's ear so that now Louisiana buyers can buy my bulls or my heifers hassle-free. Oklahoma buyers, you name the state, it doesn't matter. If I can, I want to do everything that I can from a personal perspective, from Brown Land and Cattle, to make my animals more marketable and provide more options and more places for these animals to be sold. If I want to limit my market, I simply don't tag these cattle, and I would have the attitude that, well, John Doe, you live in Arkansas. If you want to take him to Arkansas, that's up to you, but you do what is required. Because we are very easily able to electronically identify these animals. We get all of our tags every year from the Texas Animal Health Commission. I apply all of these tags to our personal ranch calves that we sell private treaty heifers. We send a lot of feeder cattle to feed yards. Those cattle are not crossing state lines, but I use EIDs anyway. Ultimately, because I am trying to help our industry in disease traceability, but from a more operational perspective, that helps me with data management. I can scan ear tags very easily. A producer is not required to have any of the technology, the scanners, tag readers, scale heads, anything you want to call them, to apply an electronic ID to their animal. So this is not a cost issue. From our backgrounding yard perspective, where I am preparing all of these bulls for my customers to have bull sales in the fall and in the spring, I put electronic tags in all of my customers' bulls' ears, and I do that by my choice so that I can help identify those animals. Some of those bulls come in without ear tags, without tattoos, and without brands. And if you've got 100 Beefmaster bulls out here and none of them are marked in any way, who belongs to who? Well, I use an electronic tag because I put the tag in the bull's ear, and then I've got a scale head, shoot side, and I enter all of the owner info. Download it into Excel spreadsheet, and if animals lose tags later on, I can very easily identify those animals. So I think it's the responsibility, personally, I think it's the responsibility of the cattle producer who is raising breeding age bulls or females that wants to market those animals. I think they need to do the best they can do to provide their animals to the greatest market they can. And if that means putting in an electronic ID in their ear, those animals are going to be over 18 months of age. And if a buyer in Oklahoma knows that they're already identified and I don't have to worry about that, I'm going to be much more willing to buy animals in that sale. The other thing that I think people need to understand, I think there were several questions in the queue maybe relating to who's responsible for tagging if they're going out of state. So in order for Texas cattle to be sold into Louisiana, Oklahoma, New Mexico, any other state, they have to have a health certificate, and the veterinarian has to provide a certificate of veterinary inspection, and those veterinarians are required to do certain things. And so if I don't identify the animal myself with the tag, the veterinarian will. And now he's going to charge you for it on top of a regular health paper. So I think we all need to do our due diligence, and we need to tag our cattle. And that's a service that I provide to my customers here. That way my buyers don't have to worry about it. It's already done and they are more inclined to buy my animals.
That's great. We're going to go ahead and switch over to our Q&A box. We're getting a lot of really great questions over there. And so if you're watching and you do have a question, go ahead and drop that in this Q&A box. We've got 13 minutes before 8 o'clock. I know there's a debate on TV tonight, so we'll try to end this right at 8. A few really great questions have come through. Dr. Turner, I'm going to send the first question your way. How long is EID data retained at the USDA, and how long do producers have to retain their data?
Yeah, Emily, that's a great question. And any of the data that is required to be retained is required to be retained for 5 years. And that's kind of species dependent, but for cattle and bison, it's 5 years. There are a couple of species, the way that livestock are produced, for example, swine and poultry, you only have to keep that information for 2 years. And so the federal government considers it the same way. So we are obliged to keep it, and the states are also required to keep that data for 5 years. And that's what we aim to do. The aim is not necessarily to keep that stuff for longer, or even to, at the same token, the aim is not to go through and purge all of that data, because, you know, as we mentioned on this call, some of those breeding animals, some of those animals that make it into the breeding herd year over year are going to be around for longer than 5 years. So it may make sense that anyone has some data that's older than that, but really the requirement is for 5 years in most cases.
That's great. And then another question, Dr. Turner, while we've got you, a great question. Let's say you take your cattle to the vet to get brucellosis tags. Will they automatically start installing EID tags instead of those metal clip tags when vaccinating for brucellosis?
I will say that the answer is that they should be, if that process is happening on or after November 5th. That's the intent, because the official identification is required for brucellosis vaccination, and those orange metal tags will no longer be official identification ear tags after November 5th. So for those, some of the folks in the fall, depending on what time they are getting that done to by their veterinarian, I should say, that may be the case where they still can use the metal clip tags if they're there, but they may decide for a variety of reasons beforehand to go and start to use an orange RFID tag, or they may, after, if that's happening on November 5th and afterwards, though, they would be required for an animal without any official ID to use an electronically readable official ID tag for that. I would encourage everybody to touch base with your veterinarians as you go in, just to make sure, because for the most part, most of the cattle veterinarians are aware of this as well. But it never hurts to double check before Doc reaches into the truck and pulls something out that you weren't expecting.
That's great. Ken, I think this question is probably best directed to you. A question from the audience: if I take a cow-calf pair to a Texas auction facility without a required ear tag, whose responsibility is it to tag those animals if they end up going across state lines?
Well, in most cases, depending on what they do, there will be some markets that will continue to ID cattle like they do today. So that market will ID the animal. They're putting the metal clip in. They will then put the electronic ID in. The tags are free, so it'll be just as they have been. Then there'll be some markets that may not ID any of the animals that go through their facility of 18 months or older. At that point in time, then it'll be the responsibility when the veterinarian comes out to do a health certificate. He'll run those through the chute. He'll put the EID tags in the ones that do not have metal clips. And if he's getting the tags free, he may not charge them at all for the tags. Charge them for the services. He may pass along a cost for putting those tags in. I don't know that. That'll be each individual vet decides that, but that will not be the seller's responsibility. The responsibility of the veterinarian, and whatever cost he may have will pass that on to that particular buyer out of state. We in our facility will continue to do all the female sales we have, we tag everything prior to it. So that makes it very much the ease of the buyer to obtain those animals, because usually after most of our sales, we
Hey, Ken, you hit the mute button.
oh, sorry. So I think what I got back is that we are going to continue to do what we do, and that's basically we ID all of our female sales.
Ken, I think we're coming in and out
Yeah,
on
I'm
your
having
end.
problems. I'm not sure. Okay, what did
That's
I,
okay.
did you not? Basically, what I go back to and say is that in our markets across the state of Texas, there's some markets will not tag anything, and they probably or most of their cattle are going to the packers or whatever. But in cases that where you have females that come in the markets, and a lot of them go out of the state, if that market does not tag those, it'll then be the responsibility of the buyer, more than likely that the vet will charge them possibly additional charge for applying those tags. But if they're getting them free, they probably should not pass that cost of the tag because they're getting it free. But it should be not any more than what a health certificate is today. Now, in our facility, where we do our special female sales, we'll be tagging those cattle ahead of time, just like we always do. If they come in and everyone has a metal clip, we don't have to put anything in them. We'll do our palpations, do everything, tie all that back. If they do not have a tag in there, we'll put electronic ear tag in them at that point in time, which the Animal Health Commission through the USDA has furnished. So there'll be no additional cost back to that producer. It'll make it more easier and quicker to be able to make a health certificate at the end of the sale to go out of state then on those classes of cattle. So I want to make it very clear, right today, anybody in Texas going to a livestock market, as of November the 5th, there are no additional changes that they have to do in order to market their animals at that livestock market. The markets will do different things at times if they're going out of state or whatever, but you as a producer still have the same ease of process and the comfort zone, unload the cattle, and they will be taken care of then on out from that livestock market.
Great ad, Ken. I've got another question, and I'm not sure. I'll open the floor to anyone who feels best fit to answer this. Let's say someone lives near the border, and they're transporting across the Texas state line into Oklahoma or New Mexico or whatever it may be. And they are transporting an animal that does not fall under the rule. Maybe it's an 18-month-old or younger animal. How should that be proven to state inspection officials? Maybe Dr. Turner, this might be the right question for you. How do producers prove that their animals are exempt from this rule? Or if anybody else has anything to add, I'm happy to take that feedback as well.
Yeah, I guess real quick, I'll just jump in that like for some of those compliance stops or some of those compliance checks, we've worked with the states and the state veterinarians' offices, and we continue to work with to kind of answer those questions and to educate those offices and those departments of agriculture, realizing that that information is going to get out there at a different pace and a different speed for different folks. So in that case where the producer is near a state line and regularly moving animals like that, and it's a class of animals, whether it's the age or even it's a destination, right? That doesn't require official ID. That inspector who's checking either at the check station or in any other situation should understand that those are animals that haven't required official ID for 11 years, so they don't require official ID tags now. And then if they do require official ID tags, that those official ID tags that they require, that part of the equation has changed a little bit. And that's really what we're working to make sure that we've educated everybody on the regulatory side of things as well, so that there's not that hassle, that unnecessary hassle when those types of stops happen.
That's great. We've got another question. Sigrid, this may be a question directed towards you. Are there any exemptions for stock show animals crossing state lines?
So if an animal is going to rodeo, show, or exhibition, they are subject to this rule. Some of the exemptions, animals that are not subject to the rule, since that seems like where the question is angled, animals going direct to slaughter, are not subject to this rule. They do not need an EID tag, even if they meet those other criteria. Animals that are in a commuter herd that are moving across state lines on a pasture to pasture movement permit. Animals, again, staying within the state, not crossing state lines. Those are some of the scenarios where you would not need this. But if that animal is going to rodeo, show, or exhibition, they are subject to the requirements of the rule. So they would need that EID tag.
And Sigrid, I would just chime in that, and maybe this is where the question was going to, regardless of age, because that requirement for show and exhibition animals does not have necessarily any exception for showing younger animals or anything.
Yeah, and actually, one more thing to add on to that. Thank you, Dr. Turner. I think a concept that is helpful to sort of think about here, and something that I think about every time I get one of these hypotheticals and I'm thinking through whether an animal would be subject to this or not, is this idea of commingling. Commingling is where the risk factor is introduced, right, for the spread of a disease. So when you look at some of the really, major stock shows that take place across the country, these are huge events with cattle coming from every corner of the country, very condensed for a short period of time, and then literally exploding back outwards to every portion of the country. So from a disease standpoint, that's a pretty high risk event, right? Not saying that anybody's doing anything wrong, not saying that producers aren't being responsible, but just from a scientific standpoint, that's a place where you could run into some serious trouble with a disease vector. And so those scenarios where you have a lot of commingling of cattle are the scenarios where inherently producers, as well as the federal government who's tasked with overseeing this, are going to have more of a concern when it comes to disease traceability. And so that's, I think, at least partially, not trying to speak for USDA here, but I think that is part of the motivation behind that broad requirement when it comes to anything going to rodeo, show, or exhibition.
Great, thanks, Sigrid. We're going to wrap it up. This will be our last question. Those of you who have yet to get your questions answered or have remaining questions, you can email your question to education@tscra.org, and we will work tomorrow to get all of these questions answered. I know there are some really great questions that we weren't able to get to tonight. So education@tscra.org. Last question, though. For animals that are going out of state to finish and or harvest. Let's say they're on this 18-month-old bubble. You go through and you preg check your open females or your first calf heifers, and you're sorting off your opens and realize they're kind of on this 18-month-old bubble to go out of state to finish or harvest. What are the requirements on that, producers? And Ken, Austin, y'all may be best equipped to answer that question.
Well, I think when you get there, you're looking at 18 months. You can more or less look at the size, the type of animal. You're not seeing lots of those cross the line. Those could be potentially a wet bag type animal where they had a calf, didn't rebreed back or something like that. And they're, say, right at 18 months or give or take some, you're kind of guessing that because you don't have restoration papers. A lot of those cattle today are still requiring a certificate even, and a health certificate go across state lines. It kind of depends on a little bit if they're going to the feeder market or they're going actually out to the pasture side. So those are the way they kind of look at that. There is a little bit, and Dr. Turner would have to maybe say a little bit more exactly how they define that. But typically we don't see as much of that. But if we do see, and we age everything in ours, and so we start seeing, we mark them all, a 2-year-old or a straight heifer. We look at that and then determine that on the health certificates and everything. So a straight 2-year-old, they require health certificate if they're open or whatever, whereas a straight heifer would not require a health certificate if they're going to the feed yard or whatever. So that's the way we'd look at that. More or less breeding type animals, the 18 months or older, most of those vets require a certificate going on state line to be on the safe side. That's even today, most of them will get that at that point in time.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to that, that scenario is going to be, I think enforcement's kind of a sticky situation, and we have a lot of questions about that stuff. That really, the enforcement for this rule change is going to be the same as the enforcement has been for the last 11 years. So that is to say that there's not all of a sudden going to be an inspector at every state crossing or anything like that starting November 5th. But in these types of situations, some of it will depend a little bit on the destination, right? So if it is going to that finisher, that's one type of movement. If it is going direct to harvest and it's going straight to the slaughter plant, then that actually doesn't require official ID regardless of the age, because the animal's allowed to move the direct to slaughter without official ID.
Well, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know this was very well received. Austin, Sigrid, Ken, Dr. Turner, appreciate all of your time. For those of you that are watching, this will be recorded and available on our website tomorrow. So anybody that would like the link, we're happy to circulate that around. Appreciate all of your time, and thanks to each of you for joining this evening.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate
Thanks.
you having us.